समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Peace has returned to Gaza and also for Israel. 20 of the surviving hostages are back and there is ceasefire declared in Gaza. So all the bombings and destruction has stopped for now. But see who's declaring victory and who's being hailed as a savior and victor. It isn't Netanyahu, it isn't anybody else, it is actually Donald Trump. So on the day of the return of hostages and also release of prisoners, about 1968, 1,968 of them by the Israelis, of which 250 have been in Israeli prisons for a long time, most of them convicts, many of them convicts for life, for killing Israelis, 250 of them. And in addition, about 1,700 of those detained in Gaza during the operations. Those have been released at the same time. So while this has happened, while this was happening, Donald Trump came to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. He addressed the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and see how he was addressed by the speaker of the Israeli parliament, or Knesset as it's called. Amir Ohana is the speaker of Israeli parliament. He is a former Shin Bet official. Shin Bet is the internal intelligence agency of Israel. He is also a former lawyer. And see the words he used. That's the reason I set this up with the question early on the ceasefire has come, that peace has come. Somebody is claiming to be victory, but that somebody is not even Netanyahu. It's actually Donald Trump. And I also asked, see who's being hailed as a victor. So in this case, Donald Trump is being hailed as the victor in the Middle East by the Israelis in this case. Watch, for example, Amir Ohana's words, Israeli speakers, Knesset speakers' words. He said he hailed Donald Trump as a colossus who will be enshrined in the pantheon of history. Jewish people, he said, will remember him thousands of years from now. And this is as sweeping a flourish as you can find from anybody. He said, Jewish people will remember him not as a president, not as an American president, but as a giant of Jewish history. One for whom we must look back 2.5 millennia into the mists of time to find a parallel in Cyrus the Great. Now, Cyrus the Great, I know that Cyrus is a name that we are familiar with. It's a very common name among the Parsi community. Cyrus, Darius, those are very common names among the Parsi community. So, Cyrus the Great, in fact, was indeed a Zoroastrian king. He was a Zoroastrian king who conquered Babylon. Now, the story goes that Nebuchadnezzar too had conquered Jerusalem, or Judea as that kingdom was called, and he had transported all the Jews from there to Babylon, and he sort of kept them in detention there. Remember that song that Boniem made so famous, By the Rivers of Babylon? That is to commemorate those Jews who had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon. The rivers of Babylon being Tigris and Euphrates. The history has it that once Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, he released the Jews and let them go back home and rebuild their temple. That's the reason Cyrus the Great is so central to Jewish history. And that is what the Israeli speaker said. He hailed Donald Trump to be a second Cyrus the Great. Of course, he also said that Donald Trump also deserves a Nobel Prize. So Donald Trump once again checked that box. What did Donald Trump say? He said many things. He also called Netanyahu the greatest wartime leader that he's seen. He said that he liked Netanyahu, but he's not the easiest person to deal with, right? That's because he and Netanyahu lately have also had a little bit of a tension because Trump thought he was pushing the war too long and that he could have settled for Trump's formula of peace with Hamas much earlier than he did. However, from whatever I read, it looks like it is the bombing attack that Netanyahu carried out in Doha, in Qatar. That proved decisive, and that proved decisive in multiple ways. One way is that it was a hard knock that really shook the Qataris up. The Qataris always believed that they could play all sides safely. They could play with the West, they could play with Muslim Brotherhood, they could play with Iran, they could play with the Gulfis, and they could also keep running Al Jazeera to teach the rest of the world about democracy and liberalism. However, these attacks by Israel in Qatar, in spite of the presence of the US Central Command there, in spite of all the air power and radars that Qatar itself has bought, that shook Qatar up. They figured that they were not so safe, that they were not immune to Israeli attacks, and also even the Americans did not come to their help when they were hit. That was a great humiliation for Qatar. At the same time, it shook Donald Trump up. This is what I'm reading also in the American press, and that's been coming out of the White House in terms of leaks and briefings to the American press. That Donald Trump was also furious that Netanyahu carried out this attack in Qatar, because Qatar is not just a friend of America's, but Qatar is a kind of protectorate of America's. Americans are sworn to protecting Qatar. So this attack was also a loss of face for the Americans. Obviously, this would not have happened if Americans really wanted to stop it. But they did not interfere with this. At the same time, Trump thought that this had gone too far and he had to now get peace. And after this, he invited or summoned Netanyahu back to meet him. This was during the UN General Assembly, and probably partly shared with him his new peace plan, but also read in the Riot Act that this cannot go on, because the longer it goes on, the more trouble it causes for Trump in terms of his own and his family's plans in the Middle East, because his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who is now very much a part of the negotiations, his children, Trump's own business interest, Steve Witkoff, his special envoy, his business interest. By the way, Trump in his speech hailed Steve Witkoff as the new Henry Kissinger. In fact, he said he's the Henry Kissinger who doesn't leak. So here also, by comparing his envoy to one among the most prominent diplomats in history, he took a little crack and saying Steve Witkoff is the Henry Kissinger who doesn't leak. Now, all of them have big business interests in the Middle East. And these continuing attacks and fighting and killings in Gaza was making it very difficult for the powers in the Gulf, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, who have a lot of money, who generate a lot of wealth, who have investments in the West, who needs the West's protection, who are very close allies of the West, especially the US. And that's one of the main reasons why Trump decided to draw the line now. So in a way, while he'd like to claim that he's a president of peace, he's brought about peace, it's true that he's the one who pushed for this settlement. The fact also is that he's not been so averse to violence, because he's let Netanyahu carry out these bombings all of these days. Netanyahu's kept on getting all the weaponry and ammunition that he wanted from the Americans during this period. He let Netanyahu bomb Iran for 11 days, and on the 12th, he carried out his own bombings on 3 sites in Iran, 3 nuclear sites, and then declared ceasefire for both Iran and Israel and said, I have brought in peace, so I must be the president of peace. It's also important to see how Trump worked on Netanyahu. He called him to White House 4 times, more than he's invited any other leader in 8 months, 4 times. Number 2, he made public calls to not push for his trial. In fact, he made public calls to cancel his trial, Netanyahu's trial. That is to get solidarity with the leader of Israel. Number 3, he opposed the recognition of Palestinian state, while his Western allies, European allies, one after the other, continued recognizing the state of Palestine. Trump continued to oppose it. And number 4, he joined the Israelis in bombing Iran, and he particularly bombed those 3 nuclear sites there. So with all of this, he bought leverage with Netanyahu. That is how Trump has worked here. Now, a few things. First of all, we have to see what are the larger messages in this. So number one, I would comment to you Fareed Zakaria's column from last week, who said there are 5 highlights of what's happened in the Middle East. I will not read all the 5 out for you, but I would suggest that you read the column. You will see it on your screen. I will also share a link with you. It's a very wise column, was written before the final settlement, because by that time the writing on the wall could be read, and Fareed Zakaria picked it up first. So he said, for example, that this shows that Trump is a transactional president. He's a transactional president, but also he knows how to deal with Israel, because everybody had thought that Israel is so obstinate, they will not accept any deal. And it was also believed that Netanyahu is in a situation where he cannot afford to stop the war, because if he stops the war, he's not that popular in Israel. He might lose power, and if he loses power, then the corruption cases against him get activated, because those are ongoing cases. He has immunity only as long as he is prime minister. In his speech as well today, Donald Trump, turning to the president, Isaac Herzog, who is actually from the other party. He's not from Netanyahu's party. He's from the more liberal party. He said, "Hey, I have an idea. Why don't you give him a pardon?" And he went on to add, he's the greatest wartime prime minister. He's not the easiest guy to deal with, but you can give him a pardon. What is a few cigars and champagne? So among the allegations against Netanyahu is the charge that he and his wife accepted favors and expensive gifts from rich Israelis, and that's an impropriety. So Trump brought in that champagne and cigars as well and sought pardon from the president of Israel for Prime Minister Netanyahu. So he had not missed that picture as well. And then he said, after asking the president, "Hey, pardon Netanyahu," and he said, "By the way, that wasn't in the speech, but I happen to like the gentleman right over here." Now, a few other things happen in the Middle East as a result of this. One, we have seen that the Middle Eastern powers, particularly the Gulf powers, are now fully aligned with the West. And whether they say it or not, they are also aligned with Israel. Now, Gaza will be rebuilt. Gaza right now will be put under the administration of an international body, which will be led more or less by Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister, but will have Donald Trump as its presiding deity. Now they will collect the money to rebuild it. There is a big summit going on in
Sharm el Sheikh
immediately after Trump finishes his visit to Israel, and that is where 20 world leaders, including leaders of most Muslim countries, Pakistan included, will attend. That's also where the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was invited, but India has decided to send a Minister of State in the Ministry of External Affairs. I suppose that is where they'll figure out from how to raise the money to rebuild Gaza. The other thing is things that haven't yet been signed. Hamas is disarming. So that was part of the plan. Hamas said we will negotiate it once the ceasefire is done and exchange of hostages, etc. is done. But Trump has presumed that Hamas will be disarmed, and I don't think it's an unsafe presumption to make, because Hamas in this case, no country is willing to support. Hamas also realizes that Iran, at least for now, is nearly finished as a power in the region. It's almost impossible for Iran to think of reviving its nuclear program in years to come. Maybe 10 years from now, who knows? Because also there are countries that proliferate. Other countries could proliferate to Iran, but right now doesn't look like they will do it. And Trump said this in his speech also. He said, "We are ready to negotiate with Iran whenever you are." And he said, "Don't worry, the Iranians will not resume their nuclear program because they don't want to be digging those deep holes in the mountains to see them flattened." He was referring to his own bombing operations in those mountains. So he said that it does, however, seem that Iran at this moment is greatly weakened. For 15 years, its economy has suffered because of sanctions. Iran's friends are weakened as well, and within the Islamic world, Iran is isolated because the Arab world is absolutely hostile to Iran, whatever they might say, whatever the pretense, they fear Iran and Iran's own proxies, that is Hamas, Hezbollah is finished for now, and Iran also has no connection with Hezbollah because in Syria, Assad has fallen. And Syria now has a regime which is not Iran friendly. So Iran does not have that access through Iraq and Syria into Lebanon, where the Hezbollah is. So Hezbollah has been cut off. Hezbollah is finished. Hamas is on way to being finished, and Houthis are greatly weakened because Houthis also, for their ammunition, for their weaponry, everything, money, they rely upon the Iranians. So it is in that situation that the architecture of the Middle East and the Islamic world has changed entirely. It is in this situation, and you can see why, that the Saudis have gone to the Pakistanis and revived their old mutual defense arrangement. That is by way of getting reassurance for themselves. But I won't be surprised if this has also been encouraged by the Americans, because they want to bring in as much of the Islamic world into this tent as possible. Trump had more than an hour-long speech, so I will not go into everything. But you know what his speech does in a way? It helps us summarize or maybe cut the clutter from this big story, because Trump speaks out the big aspects of what has happened. In the process, he says that Marco Rubio will probably be the greatest Secretary of State ever. I told you that he said Steve Witkoff is the Henry Kissinger who doesn't leak. He also praises Pete Hegseth, his Secretary of Defense, and also sort of obliquely goes to explain why he renamed the Department of Defense Department of War, although he kept on saying that he abhors war, that he is a president of peace. He said, for example, that my personality is for stopping wars, not for making wars. And then he says, almost sort of ominously, that we, as in America, we have weapons nobody can dream of. I hope we never have to use them. And then, of course, he brings in an element of religion and thanks, quote unquote, Almighty God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he said, this is the historic dawn of a new Middle East. Now, many questions still arise. I can't answer all of them right now, but I would say keep an eye out for these. I will elaborate on some wherever I feel a little bit confident about having some details, but some of it is in the realm of speculation. One, for example, is the war really over? I would say for now, more or less, yes, because Hamas is so weakened. Hamas has been short of ammunition for a long time. Iranians can't supply them. Qatar will not help them with anything. So for now, the war, you could say, is over. What happens in the future, you can never say about the Middle East, but for now, the war seems to be over. Number two, will Hamas disarm? I'm not sure. I can't say this. I think there is some implicit commitment that they will, but between Netanyahu and Hamas, any side could go back on its promises. However, Hamas right now is in a very weakened position, mainly because Iranians are in a weakened position. And that's why it is possible that Hamas might disarm for now, or at least disarm to the extent that will be visible. However, as the idea, it will not go away. Hamas as the idea will remain. Because what is Hamas? Hamas is actually the Palestinian version of Muslim Brotherhood. And Muslim Brotherhood will remain in a lot of the Islamic world, particularly in the Middle East. Number three, who will pay to build and govern Gaza? That is something on which we will get some more clarity after 20 country summit in
Sharm el-Sheikh.
However, it's evident that bulk of the money will come from the rich Arab countries, and for now, there will be at least an interim international administration. Then, future of Benjamin Netanyahu. Now the war is over. Now what happens? Because he is not very popular in Israel, and you can see that when Steve Witkoff addressed a rally in Israel, when he mentioned Bibi Netanyahu, he got boos. And then once he brought in Donald Trump, he got the cheers. So at this point in Israel, it's an unusual situation where the president of the US is much more popular on the street than their own prime minister. So once the dust settles, maybe rebuilding starts in Gaza, and final touches are put to this plan, then questions will start to get raised again about Netanyahu. So then politics will begin. As long as the war was on 736 days, politics was in suspension. It was in suspended animation. Now Israeli politics will come back. So let us see what happens with Netanyahu. Number five, why the deal now? Why not 6 months earlier? Why not 1 year earlier? On May 31 last year, May 31, 2024, Biden came up with a deal that wasn't very different from this deal. Biden came up with a deal, but in a way both sides resiled from it, but more prominently Netanyahu resiled from it. He did not want it, although that deal had been blessed also by the UN Security Council in a resolution. Netanyahu did not want it. He wanted to declare victory. At the same time, Hamas, there were elements in Hamas who thought they could keep fighting on. But once the killing of Yahya Sinwar, who was the architect of October 7, 2023, once that happened, then the weakening, institutional weakening of Hamas started at the leadership level. And with that came the military weakening, which got compounded with the attacks on Iran, the 12-day attacks on Iran, which really enfeebled the Iranians and left them without an active nuclear program. They lost so many scientists, so many top generals, but also it left them almost denuded of their air defenses. And that is what also influenced Hamas subsequently. For Israel, the rise of Donald Trump and the dadagiri that Donald Trump has, he let Netanyahu do what he was doing. He also helped him subdue Iran. Frankly, he let him carry out that bombing attack in Qatar, and then went through the full drama of summoning him to the White House and getting him to read out a written apology to the Prime Minister of Qatar, his counterpart, and have cameras record it. Now, if you tell me that this was not play acting, that they were not in cahoots doing this, then I think either you are very naive or you think I am very naive, because no such thing happens at that level. Trump is capable of doing this because Trump doesn't do diplomacy in the old style. There's an interview in American media with J.D. Vance where he says that Trump's idea of doing diplomacy is not by using diplomats with 40-year experience who are then taking T's and dotting I's. That's my line. He looks at the big picture. He looks at the big picture and he takes the big decision. Then professionals and others can fill in the blanks, and that is what he has done in this case. Now, let me again list for you a few things that have happened as a consequence of October 7, 2023. You know, this is the era of conspiracy theories. There is a conspiracy theory about everything. So there is a conspiracy theory quite popular on internet also that 9/11 was some kind of a Zionist plot, right? That's a conspiracy theory. I didn't say it. I don't want somebody taking out 20 seconds and saying Shekhar Gupta said it. But it's a conspiracy theory. Now, I'm not saying it's a conspiracy theory. But really, if there had to be one, then who gained the most from October 7, 2023? So Hamas itself, if they planned October 7, 2023, it's difficult for me to see what is it that they were after. Besides the cheap thrill of killing 1,200 people then, taking 250 hostages, of which quite a few died in captivity, quite a few were returned over time. The last 20 got returned today. In the process, Gaza got destroyed, Hamas got destroyed, Hezbollah got destroyed, a regime change took place in Syria. Houthis have got bombed by the Israelis. After having been bombed by the Saudis and UAE, they've got bombed by the Israelis in a systematic way and also by the Americans, and the Iranian power has been so enfeebled as well. So who is it who gained net? I know that 1,200 people were killed in October 7, 2023 attacks. 250 were taken hostages. More than 1,000 Israeli soldiers have died fighting in Gaza. Also that 67,000 people have died in Gaza. It's a lot of people. And it's more destruction in Gaza than we've seen carried out anywhere in our living history. Much more. Okay, maybe you can say Aleppo in Syria, but that was one part of a city. This is an entire region of more than 2 million people, which has been completely laid waste. All of this happened as a result of October 7, 2023. And see, in the end, net, what is the American and Western objective? What has it been since the 1940s, since the formation of Israel? It has been to get legitimacy for Israel. Now, part of that happened in the 70s with Camp David. In the course of time, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, 3 important Muslim countries recognized Israel and exchanged embassies there. With Abraham Accords, UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, so many other Muslim countries, Arab countries also came in to recognize Israel. Now, part of that unfinished business for Israel's Western backers is to get more Islamic countries to recognize Israel and to have normal relations with them. That is Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and you push it eastwards, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia. If you see the speech that Indonesian president delivered at the UN General Assembly, he said there can be no peace in the Middle East, there can be no settlement of the Palestinian issue until Israel's security is guaranteed. So you can see the Western powers are getting closer to their objective. The one thing that gets left out, and you will ask me how come I haven't mentioned it, that's because that's the point I am least sure of. What happens now to the two-state solution? That is something to which India is also committed. Now you can see that even if there is a two-state solution, maybe my own view is that in the course of time, there will be a two-state solution. Now what will that second state be? Will that second state be just the West Bank region? And if settlements keep growing, then West Bank will begin to look like a bunch of enclaves surrounded by Jewish populations, a bit like the South Africans did by building these Bantustans, as these were called, around South Africa, the apartheid regime. I don't think the global community has an appetite for that. So global community in the course of time will want some kind of a Palestinian state. Definitely Hamas will not be part of that. Most likely Gaza will have a separate dispensation from that. It's also true that what's happened so far will embolden the right in Israel, and they will become even more resistant to the idea of a two-state solution. That is an issue that will fester now, and let us see how this rolls out. We will keep tracking this story for you.